Hey, everybody. This is John Sherwood with the Unpolished Church podcast. Thanks for joining us. Today, I want to jump into a solo episode about how to choose a church. But before we do that, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review on your favorite platform. We look forward to continuing to journey together as an unpolished community of Jesus followers. So I often get this question when I'm talking to people about this microchurch expression that we have in our local context. And that question often revolves around how to think about choosing a church to go to. Now, of course, the primary modality that most people try to figure out which church to go to through is often Google. Sometimes you might have a personal recommendation, a relationship or a family member or a friend that goes to a particular church and they may invite you. But for the vast majority of believing people who might be looking for a church for a variety of ways are going to go to Google to try to find the best fit for themselves. And those reasons of why people might be looking to find a church could vary from taking a new job, moving to a new city, caring for an aging or dying parent. Perhaps there's been some sort of fallout or disruption in the current church environment that they're in. Of course, there are many, many people, especially in the West since COVID, that have kind of just given up and left the institutionalized church because of the COVID event that has really just massively shifted how we understand connection and relationship, and technology has been baked into the way that we meet and work, and all kinds of things have changed that we've talked about even on previous episodes. So there can be a variety of ways that people are put into a position to have to consider finding a new church home. And often we find people getting connected to our microchurch network that are in these positions because they find us on Google, and often they're looking for something that they think we are going to be a bit of a closer fit than perhaps like more of a traditional church expression for them. And so I've had a lot of these conversations over the years about how to think about how to choose a church, or perhaps some people may be moving and they're from a particular denominational heritage or tradition, and they're just thinking, hey, I'm just going to find that denominational church there in that new city or that new country or whatever. And that may be a great fit for some people. But if there's going to be a change, then how do you choose, right? Perhaps there has been some catalyst in your denominational heritage or in your tradition that has caused you to think, maybe I need to find a different kind of church home, even a different kind of, tradition or denominational heritage. Perhaps there's been some shift in your theology or the tradition's theology, and there can be all kinds of reasons why people are looking for a new church home. One that we often hear frequently is a lack of real relationship and community in the church environment that the people are leaving or coming from. And one of the things that I find that many, many people are looking for when they think about choosing a church home is they're looking for intentional, authentic, sincere relationship. And often, especially if they're coming from like a traditional church expression environment, the relational connections have usually been very minimal and often very surfacey. And we've talked a lot about some of the downsides and some of the downfalls of traditional church expressions. That's one of them, right? Is that it can really struggle to build meaningful relational intimacy for a broad swath of people, especially at the volume of people that most traditional church expressions operate in. And so they will come to our microchurch network, assuming and expecting for there to be a greater emotional and relational intimacy that is allowed because of how we're like structured. And I think that that's very true. And I think we experience that in a myriad of ways. But one of the things that I think of when I think about how to choose a church, the primary framework, the primary motivator, the primary, just the primary thing that should surface above all else for a mature believer in Jesus is not primarily choosing from some sort of selfish lens, some sort of selfish motivation, right? And those kinds of things can happen all the time, right? Whether it's, I really want a different style of worship music, or I really want this for my children, which may not be selfish. It may be really trying to focus on their spiritual development and enrichment. And if so, that can be a beautiful motivation to consider a new church home. But oftentimes it can be just more for their entertainment, more for the ability to have essentially babysitting for a couple of hours on a Sunday morning, and these kinds of things that are really at its root a bit more self-focused, self-centered, self-serving motives for why I would look for a new church family. Other selfish motivations have to do with, I don't like the preaching style or the schedule, or it doesn't have people that are just like me and in my life stage or liking the same hobbies, and so on and so on and so on. You can imagine the numerous ways in which we look through a primarily selfish lens to think about the body of Christ, to think about the church, his bride. And so for me, what I would tell people and what I would hope to embody in the situations where I might be looking for a new church home or a new church fellowship or denominational heritage is I would want to be looking through a lens that is not primarily self-focused, but is primarily looking to the interests of others, right? A la Philippians 2, that Christ left us an example that we should become humble. We should humble ourselves like Jesus did and not consider our own interest only, but also the interests of others. And so as a mature believer, right, this is all kind of predicated on the idea of dealing with a mature Christian believer. Perhaps an immature believer, whether they're young in the faith or not, may struggle, right, to think in these ways. But I think this is the purpose of what the scriptures are trying to help us to see, is that a mature believer understands their walk with Christ, and therefore their connection with his body is not primarily about what they can get from it, but primarily how can they serve the body? How can they serve the broader world through their function in the body as a hand, as an eye, as an arm, etc. So when you're thinking about how to choose a church, I would encourage you to consider the primary framework in which you're thinking about this to be, how can you serve others as Jesus has served you? And my faith is that if that is our primary motivating framework, it's going to lead us to much better decisions about where to go and where to try to plug in and where to try to covenant and commit and really relationally engage with other flawed, broken human followers of Jesus, right? So if that's our primary framework, if we're trying to think not selfishly, but rather in light of Jesus, who came not to be served, but to serve, if we're thinking in that framework, then I think that we will be led in much healthier, enriching decisions for ourselves and for others. Now, that does not mean that every decision is necessarily going to work out, or it's going to be free from conflict, or that, the next church that you try to choose through this selfless giving framework means that it's going to go great. Of course, that's not guaranteed. And in many ways, this is, in fact, what it means to follow Jesus, is to sign up for a life of suffering as we pour ourselves out for the sake of others. That's unavoidable. However, there are also really, really not great, terrible reasons to choose a church. As I already mentioned, those selfish ones, but also the ones where it can, the ones where it like doesn't disrupt or ruffle us in any way. And I know that this is ultimately still like connected to that selfish framework, and perhaps probably the most common way that I see this selfish motivation enacted through people as they're trying to choose church. And that is, they're looking for a place that really agrees with them, right? I just had a conversation recently with some people, and, they're wanting a church that agrees with what they already think and are already like in a position where they're not very willing to be challenged to think anything different. That's going to be very, very challenging to find a church that agrees with everything you think, or even perhaps the very important things that you think, if there is an unwillingness to learn or to be shaped or to be persuaded in both directions, of course. But I think that that is the nature of the body of Christ. And so if we're coming to this intersection of trying to choose a new church home, and we're looking and shopping around for those that are already going to align with us in all the ways that we think are important, and there's an unwillingness on our part to be humble, to be willing to learn, to listen, to explore perhaps something different than what we already think, or different than what we think we already think, then it's really not going to go well. You're ultimately going to be disappointed. It's kind of like a marriage, right? Or dating. If somebody is dating another person for the purposes of a long-term, lifelong covenanted partnership before God, right? If someone is going to date someone else seeking to marry in a holy matrimony that is for the rest of their life, but they're only doing that with someone that is going to fill out all of their check boxes and fill out all their requirements, you're going to be very disappointed. I've lived enough life and been married long enough to know that is a mirage, right? That's an illusion. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that there's nothing that you're looking for to yoke yourself with, to covenant yourself with, to partner yourself with for the lifelong. But that doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get every single thing on your list either. And so we have to be careful about that, whether in marriage or in how to choose a church, which I do think that there are some similar covenantal kind of ideas caught up in marriage and also in our marriage to Jesus and his body. And obviously this language is used throughout the New Testament, especially by Paul. And so we got to be careful that we're not like over scrutinizing the body or trying to, create a list that's so long that we're only going to be left with disappointment. But at the same time, it's not just a free for all of like, well, I guess it doesn't really matter and I'll just go anywhere or choose anyone to marry or covenant with any body of believers. But I do think that there's an important piece that we have to be willing to be challenged, to be disrupted. We have to allow the body of Christ to do the work of Christ in us, not just look for a church that's going to always stroke me by being in agreement with me, right? And this is part of the battle that we face in our cultural context where the internet and social media and things have and just media in general have allowed for these silos to be created where I can find a group of people that are just like me or think just like me or agree on these matters. I can find the political allegiances with people who think just like I do ideologically. I can find the group on Facebook that likes all just the weird little niche things that I do. And it ends up creating these like silos that become so insular and so insulated that it becomes an echo chamber and you can't grow. In fact, you often devolve. You kind of like shrink further into this silo and miss out on the rich opportunity that Jesus desires for his body to have. And that is to learn how to love those that are not like you, and not just attach to people that you don't have to go through that challenge with. And we can do that when we approach how to choose a church too. We can choose churches or we can choose a church family where we think there will be the least amount of disruption, the least amount of challenge for me personally, whether that's theologically, whether that's practically in terms of schedule, whether that's ethnically or racially in terms of the makeup and the demographics, right? Like there are some real boundaries that we have to navigate, like language. If I walk into, a South Korean church and all they speak is Korean and I don't speak Korean, there's going to be a challenge there. And obviously that specific language barrier is something that's dealt with in the scriptures all the way from the accounts of Genesis into the book of Acts and the epistles that Paul writes, where people are speaking in tongues and it's not edifying to the body because no one can understand them. So there are some barriers that we have to like navigate and realize like, okay, there's some limitations here, but just because someone doesn't look like me, just because someone comes from a different background than me, just because someone has different interests than me, or perhaps even a differing theology than me, perhaps in some way that I think is very, very central, those things aren't necessarily carte blanche, just out of the gate reasons to stay away or to not engage or to not commit or to not covenant. And so I think these ideas have to inform how we think about going to a new church or choosing a new church, whether that's in the same city that we've been residing in or that's in a new city, whatever the circumstances are that are causing us to consider leaving one church and joining another. I think it needs to be motivated primarily not through a selfish lens, but through a lens of Jesus, who humbled himself even to the point of death on a cross. And that being said, I do think also it may be helpful for a season intentionally to try different churches, But I do not think that that's a healthy long-term strategy to be the body of Christ and to receive the benefits of the body of Christ. And that's also another thing that I see very commonly in my context, is that there's like this perpetual church shopper demographic who like just kind of never can really find what they're looking for. And so they're just constantly bouncing around. It's again, coming back to the dating metaphor, right? It's like people who just perpetually date and they're kind of players or whatever, but they never really find exactly what they're looking for. No one's ever quite good enough or whatever the rationale is. And I think that stunts their emotional and spiritual well-being, right? And I think the same can happen with our church commitments as well. And it's like if you find yourself hopping from church to church every year, every 2 years or whatever, you got to recognize the common denominator. You take you with you everywhere you go. That does not mean that there's never appropriate, healthy, mature reasons to leave a church. But if that's happening consistently over long spans of time, you've got to look at there's probably something else more fundamentally broken that's going on in these dynamics. And that all being said, the bottom line is church is tough. Church is sticky. We're broken people. We're all in the process of redemption and sanctification to become more like Jesus. And we're all at different places on that journey, and none of us has fully arrived. And being a part of a church is embracing that and not running from that, because Jesus didn't run from you and Jesus didn't run from me, even though I was sticky and messy and arrogant and proud and selfish and lustful. Jesus continued to pursue me, continued to love me, continued to think not only of his own interests, but my interests as well. And so he invites us, in fact, commands us to do likewise to one another, that we would strive to learn how to love one another as he has loved us. Thanks again for being a part of this unpolished journey. And as you go out there, and if you are ever faced with now or in the future how to choose a church home, I hope that these thoughts can be helpful and edifying on your journey with Jesus. We'll see you next time.